Margaret Collins never imagined that after 40 years of marriage, she would be standing on a rainy sidewalk with nothing but 2 worn suitcases. Just hours earlier, her husband Richard had finalized their divorce, taken the family home, the savings, the investments, and nearly everything they had built together. As he walked away with his younger girlfriend on his arm, he looked back and delivered one final insult. "You never built anything, Margaret. You only lived off what I created." Humiliated and heartbroken, Margaret believed her life was over. At 72 years old, she had no idea where she would sleep, no idea how she would start again, and no reason to believe justice would ever come. But what Richard didn't know was that years earlier, during the early days of their struggling business, he had made a mistake so small that he completely forgot about it. Hidden among dusty records and long-forgotten paperwork was an old warehouse sitting on the edge of town, a crumbling property everyone considered worthless. During the divorce, Richard fought for every dollar, every asset, every possession, yet somehow he overlooked the one thing that remained legally in Margaret's name. And within months, that forgotten warehouse would become the most valuable piece of land in the entire county. The man who thought he had taken everything was about to discover that the one thing he left behind would cost him millions. And when the truth finally emerged, the woman he threw away would have the last laugh. The rain had not stopped since the morning Margaret Collins signed the divorce papers. It came down in steady sheets, turning the courthouse steps into a blur of gray reflections. She stood there for several seconds after Richard and his attorneys disappeared into a waiting black sedan, unable to move. 40 years. 40 years of marriage had ended in less than 30 minutes. The judge had spoken, the papers had been stamped, and suddenly the life she had known for decades no longer belonged to her. In her trembling hands were 2 suitcases containing everything she still owned, a few changes of clothes, some family photographs, and an old jewelry box that held little monetary value but countless memories. That was all that remained. As she slowly walked toward the bus stop, Richard's words echoed through her mind. "You never built anything, Margaret. You only lived off what I created." The cruelty of the statement hurt more than losing the house. Deep down, she knew it wasn't true. She remembered the years when Richard had worked out of a tiny rented office, when there had been months they barely had enough money to pay the bills. She remembered answering phones for his business, organizing invoices late into the night, driving deliveries when employees called in sick, and taking care of their children while Richard traveled across the state searching for contracts. Back then, they had been a team. Or at least, she had believed they were. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes. Margaret climbed aboard and sat near the back, staring out the window as familiar streets passed by. Every corner seemed to hold a memory. There was the diner where Richard had proposed, the church where they had been married, the park where Daniel and Emily had learned to ride their bicycles. Each landmark felt like a chapter from a book that someone had suddenly torn apart. Her destination was a small apartment on the edge of town. Emily, her daughter, had spent the previous week helping her find a place she could afford with the modest settlement she received from the divorce. The apartment was clean but tiny. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. A small kitchenette. Nothing like the spacious home she had lived in for decades, yet as Margaret unlocked the door and stepped inside, she forced herself to be grateful. At least she had a roof over her head. That evening, Emily arrived carrying groceries. "Mom, I brought some soup and bread," she said gently. Margaret smiled faintly. "You don't have to keep taking care of me." "Actually, I do." Emily set the bags on the counter and wrapped her arms around her mother. For a moment, Margaret nearly broke down. Emily had been the only member of the family who openly disagreed with the divorce. Daniel, on the other hand, had chosen silence. He claimed he didn't want to get involved, but Margaret knew the truth. He had sided with Richard. After dinner, Emily helped unpack boxes, while Margaret placed old photographs on a shelf. One picture showed a much younger Richard standing beside a delivery truck, his arm around her shoulders. They looked happy. She quickly turned the frame face down. "Do you regret it?" Emily suddenly asked. Margaret looked up. "Regret what?" "Spending 40 years with him." The question lingered in the room. Margaret thought carefully before answering. "No," she finally said. "I regret the man he became, but I don't regret the family we built." Emily nodded, though sadness filled her eyes. Over the next several weeks, Margaret struggled to adjust. Every morning she woke, expecting to hear the sounds of her old home. Every evening, she found herself reaching for a phone call that never came. Richard made no attempt to contact her. In fact, through mutual acquaintances, she learned that he and Vanessa were already planning extravagant vacations and discussing renovations to the house she had once called home. The humiliation deepened when neighbors began whispering. Some assumed Margaret had received a fortune in the divorce. Others believed Richard's version of events, that she had contributed little and simply walked away with a generous settlement. Few people knew how much she had sacrificed throughout the years. One afternoon, while organizing old documents in her apartment, Margaret found herself staring at a faded photograph from nearly 30 years earlier. It showed Richard standing beside several employees in front of a large warehouse. She vaguely remembered the building. Back then, Richard had purchased several storage properties while expanding his business. Most had eventually been sold. Margaret studied the image for a moment before slipping it back into the box. The warehouse meant nothing to her. At least, that's what she believed. She had no way of knowing that within a few weeks, that forgotten building would change everything. And miles away, Richard Collins was celebrating what he considered the greatest victory of his life, completely unaware that the one asset he had overlooked was quietly waiting to rewrite both of their futures forever. A month passed, and Margaret slowly settled into a routine. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was a life nonetheless. Every morning she walked to a nearby cafe, ordered a cup of tea, and sat by the window reading newspapers, or simply watching people pass by. The routine helped fill the silence. It gave structure to days that otherwise felt painfully empty. Yet no matter how hard she tried to move forward, reminders of Richard seemed to appear everywhere. One Tuesday morning, while waiting in line at the grocery store, she overheard two women discussing a recent charity gala. "Did you see Richard Collins there with that younger woman?" "Oh yes, Vanessa. They're talking about getting married." Margaret immediately looked away. The women had no idea she was standing only a few feet away. She paid for her groceries and left, without finishing the rest of her shopping. Back in her apartment, she sat alone for several hours, staring at the rain outside her window. It amazed her how quickly a person could be replaced. 40 years together, and Richard seemed determined to erase every trace of their shared history. The phone rang late that afternoon. It was Emily. "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret forced a smile into her voice. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." A long pause followed. Finally, Margaret admitted, "Some days are harder than others." Emily sighed. "You know none of this was your fault." "I know, but knowing and believing were two different things." A few days later, Margaret visited a community market downtown. She enjoyed browsing the small stalls and antique vendors. It reminded her of simpler times. As she walked between booths filled with old books and handmade crafts, a familiar voice suddenly called her name. "Mrs. Collins?" Margaret turned. Standing before her was a stocky, older man with a gray beard and weathered face. For a moment, she struggled to recognize him. Then realization struck. "Samuel?" Samuel Harris smiled warmly. It's been a long time. More than 20 years had passed since Samuel retired from Richard's company. He had supervised several storage facilities during the business's early years. The two sat together at a nearby coffee stand and spent nearly an hour catching up. Samuel listened carefully as Margaret briefly explained the divorce. His expression darkened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Margaret shrugged. "It is what it is." Samuel shook his head. "No, it isn't." For a moment, he seemed lost in thought. Then he asked a question that caught her completely off guard. "Whatever happened to Warehouse 17? Margaret blinked. "Warehouse 17? The old warehouse near Riverside Industrial Park." Margaret frowned. "I honestly don't know." Samuel looked surprised. "You mean Richard never mentioned it? Why would he?" The retired supervisor leaned back in his chair. Because it was one of the first properties your company ever bought. Margaret searched her memory. She vaguely remembered a warehouse, old brick building, leaking roof. Constant maintenance problems. Back then, it had been more of a burden than an asset. I thought Richard sold all those properties years ago, she said. Samuel slowly shook his head. Not that one. A strange feeling crept over Margaret. What do you mean? Samuel lowered his voice. I remember because that warehouse was different. Different how? When it was purchased, Richard wasn't available to sign the paperwork. Margaret listened carefully. You signed instead. She laughed softly. That doesn't mean anything. It might. Samuel's eyes narrowed. If my memory is correct, the property wasn't registered under the company. Margaret felt her pulse quicken slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying I think the warehouse was registered under your name. Silence. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Margaret shook her head. No, that can't be right. But even as she said it, uncertainty began creeping into her thoughts. Samuel shrugged. Maybe I'm wrong. He stood. But if I were you, I'd check. That evening, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Warehouse 17. The name echoed through her mind. After dinner, she opened several storage boxes she had brought from the family home. Most contained old photographs, tax returns, insurance records, and decades of forgotten paperwork. Dust filled the air as she searched. Hours passed. Midnight approached. Still nothing. Finally, exhausted, she prepared to give up. Then, she noticed an old metal filing box tucked behind a stack of folders. The lock had long since rusted away. Margaret lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of aging documents. Property records, business contracts, loan applications, many dated back more than 30 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through them. Then suddenly, she froze. One document immediately caught her attention. Property deed. Riverside Industrial District. Warehouse 17. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she unfolded the yellowed pages. The ink had faded with age, but one section remained perfectly readable. Owner, Margaret Elizabeth Collins. Margaret stared at the words. Once, twice, 3 times. Surely she was reading them wrong. Yet every time she looked, the same name appeared. Her name, not Richard's, not the company's. Hers. A wave of disbelief swept through her. She quickly searched the rest of the box. More documents emerged. Tax statements, registration certificates, insurance records. Every single one listed the same owner. Margaret Collins. For over 30 years. She sank into a chair. The warehouse still belonged to her, legally, completely. And for the first time since the divorce, something stirred inside her. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. Because if Richard had spent months fighting over every dollar, every account, every piece of property, how had he missed this? And more importantly, why had Warehouse 17 remained untouched all these years? Across town, Richard Collins sat inside an expensive restaurant, celebrating another successful business deal. He raised a glass of wine and smiled confidently. The divorce was behind him. His future looked brighter than ever. What he didn't know was that buried inside an old filing box, a forgotten piece of paper, had just awakened a mistake worth millions. And very soon, that mistake would come back to haunt him. Margaret barely slept that night. The property deed remained on her kitchen table long after midnight, illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp. Every few minutes, she found herself picking it up again, rereading the same words as if they might suddenly disappear. Margaret Elizabeth Collins. It felt impossible. For weeks, she had lived with the belief that Richard had taken everything. Now, sitting alone in her tiny apartment, she was staring at proof that one piece of their past had somehow escaped his grasp. But a question continued to trouble her. If the warehouse truly belonged to her, why had Richard never transferred it? And why had he ignored it during the divorce? The next morning, Margaret called attorney James Carter. 2 days later, she sat across from him inside a modest law office downtown. James carefully examined every document she had brought. The room was silent, except for the occasional turning of paper. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Finally, James removed his glasses. "Mrs. Collins," he said slowly. Margaret leaned forward. "Yes? I've reviewed these records 3 times." Her heart pounded. "And?" James placed the deed on the desk. "As far as I can tell, Warehouse 17 is legally yours." Margaret stared at him. The words sounded unreal. "You mean completely mine?" "Completely." She swallowed hard. "But there must be some mistake." James shook his head. "The ownership history is very clear." He opened another file. "The property was purchased 34 years ago." Margaret nodded. "During the early years of the business." "Exactly." James pointed to a signature. Richard was overseas at the time. Margaret recognized her younger handwriting immediately. Her signature, her initials, her name, everything. "The property was registered solely under you," James continued. "More importantly," he paused, "there is no evidence that ownership was ever transferred." For a moment, Margaret simply sat there. Then she laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because after months of pain and humiliation, the absurdity of the situation finally struck her. Richard had hired some of the most expensive divorce attorneys in the state. He had spent months fighting over investments, months analyzing bank accounts, months ensuring every valuable asset remained under his control, and yet somehow he had overlooked an entire property. James smiled slightly. "I imagine Mr. Collins won't be very happy when he learns this." Margaret's expression remained calm. "I'm not interested in making him unhappy." "No?" She looked out the window. "I just want to understand what this warehouse is worth." The attorney hesitated. "That's where things become interesting." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" James opened another document. "I did some preliminary research." He slid a map across the desk. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then she noticed several highlighted sections surrounding the warehouse. A large portion of the industrial district had been marked in red. "What am I looking at?" James folded his hands. 3 months ago, the city approved a major redevelopment project. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Redevelopment? The largest infrastructure project this county has seen in decades. She felt a sudden chill. "What kind of project?" "A transportation hub." James pointed to the map. "New rail connections." Another section. "Commercial centers." Another. "Residential developments." Then finally, his finger stopped directly over Warehouse 17. Margaret's pulse quickened. The warehouse sat almost exactly in the center of everything. James looked at her carefully. "Do you understand what that means?" She slowly shook her head. "No. It means your warehouse is no longer sitting in the middle of nowhere." The room fell silent. James leaned back. "Today, developers are fighting for land in that district." Margaret's stomach tightened. "How much could it be worth?" The attorney hesitated. "I honestly don't know yet." Then he smiled. "But I can tell you one thing." "What?" "It is worth far more than Richard ever imagined." 3 days later, Margaret drove to Warehouse 17 for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The property stood on the edge of Riverside Industrial Park, or at least what used to be Riverside Industrial Park. Construction crews now occupied nearby lots. Bulldozers moved earth. Surveyors walked across open fields. Large signs advertised future commercial developments. Everything around the warehouse was changing. Everything except the warehouse itself. The building looked ancient. Faded brick walls, broken windows, rust-covered steel doors. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete. To anyone passing by, it appeared worthless. Margaret parked her car and slowly stepped out. For several moments, she simply stood there. Memories flooded back. She remembered visiting the property with Richard decades earlier. Back then, they had been struggling. Every dollar mattered. Every opportunity felt important. Richard had spoken excitedly about expansion, growth, the future, together. Margaret smiled sadly. How strange that the only thing Richard forgot was the one thing they had purchased during the happiest years of their marriage. She walked toward the entrance. The old lock had long since rusted. With some effort, she pushed the door open. A loud groan echoed through the enormous building. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. The interior was vast, empty, silent, abandoned. Yet standing there, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in months. Possibility. For the first time since the divorce, she wasn't looking backward. She was looking forward. The following week, the first phone call arrived. Then another, and another. By Friday, 5 separate companies had contacted James Carter asking about Warehouse 17. Margaret couldn't understand why, until Olivia Bennett walked into her attorney's office. Olivia was confident, professional, and direct, the kind of woman who wasted no time. After introductions, she placed a folder on the table. Mrs. Collins, I'll be honest. Margaret nodded. I appreciate honesty. Olivia smiled. Good. She opened the folder. Inside were maps, development plans, property analyses, projected growth figures, numbers far larger than anything Margaret had expected. Then Olivia said the sentence that changed everything. We would like to purchase your warehouse. Margaret looked at her calmly. For how much? Olivia slid a document across the desk. Margaret glanced down. Her eyes widened. For several seconds she couldn't speak. The offer exceeded the value of her divorce settlement, several times over. Finally she whispered, This can't be real. Olivia nodded. Oh, it's real. Margaret looked again. Then again, still unable to believe it. Olivia leaned forward. And that's only our opening offer. The room suddenly felt smaller. James Carter smiled quietly, because he knew something Margaret did not. The bidding war hadn't even started yet, and at that exact moment, across town, Richard Collins was about to receive a phone call that would turn all the confidence he had felt since the divorce into absolute panic. A business associate had just discovered that Warehouse 17, the property Richard believed was worthless, was now one of the most valuable parcels of land in the entire county. And, according to public records, it didn't belong to him. Richard Collins was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone vibrated. Normally, he ignored calls during meetings, but when he saw the name on the screen, he immediately excused himself. It was one of the largest real estate investors in the region. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet by the time it ended, the color had drained from Richard's face. "What did you just say?" he asked. The investor repeated himself. "We've been trying to locate the owner of Warehouse 17. Richard frowned. "Why are you calling me about that old dump?" There was a brief silence. Then came the answer. "Because it's sitting in the center of the Riverside redevelopment zone." Richard laughed. "You must have the wrong property." "We don't." The investor paused. "That warehouse is now one of the most strategically valuable locations in the county." Richard's smile disappeared. His grip tightened around the phone. "And who owns it?" Another pause. Then the words hit him like a freight train. Margaret Collins. Silence. For a moment, Richard genuinely thought he had misheard. "That's impossible. I'm looking at the public records right now." Richard's heartbeat accelerated. "No," the investor continued. "The property has been registered solely under Margaret's name for over 30 years. Richard ended the call without another word. For several seconds, he stood frozen. Then he immediately contacted his legal team. Within an hour, 3 attorneys were reviewing documents. By late afternoon, they delivered the same conclusion. The warehouse belonged to Margaret, legally, completely. And there was absolutely nothing Richard could do about it. The realization struck harder than he expected, not because he cared about the warehouse itself, but because he understood what it represented. Control. For the first time in decades, he had lost it. That evening, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at old files. Vanessa entered carrying 2 glasses of wine. She immediately sensed something was wrong. What happened? Richard didn't answer. Vanessa placed the glasses down. "Richard?" He finally looked up. The warehouse. What warehouse? Warehouse 17. Vanessa frowned. The old building nobody wanted? Richard nodded slowly. Apparently everybody wants it now. Her expression changed. What does that mean? Richard slid a valuation report across the desk. Vanessa picked it up. At first, she looked confused. Then her eyes widened, and widened further. These numbers can't be real. They are. The room fell silent. Vanessa quickly turned to the final page. Projected future value, potential development value, estimated market demand. Her breathing slowed. Then she asked the question Richard had been dreading. Who owns it? Richard didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor. Finally, he said, Margaret. The silence that followed felt heavier than stone. For the first time since the divorce, Richard couldn't sleep. At 3 a.m, he sat alone in the dark, replaying every detail. How had he missed it? How had his lawyers missed it? The answer was painfully simple. Because 30 years earlier, the property had seemed worthless. Back then, nobody cared about it. Nobody expected the area to become valuable. Nobody imagined the city would eventually build an entire transportation hub around it. And during the divorce, Richard had focused only on assets he already considered important. The mansion, the investments, the company, the stocks, the luxury vehicles. The warehouse had never crossed his mind. Now it was worth millions, possibly tens of millions, and it belonged to the woman he had thrown away. Meanwhile, Margaret's life was beginning to change. For the first time in months, she smiled more often. Not because of the money, not yet. The warehouse hadn't even been sold, but something far more valuable had returned. Her confidence. The woman who had left the courthouse believing her life was over was slowly disappearing. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who no longer saw herself as a victim. One afternoon, Emily joined her for lunch. You look different, Emily said. Margaret laughed. Different how? Happier. Margaret considered the question, then smiled. I think I finally remembered who I am. Emily squeezed her hand. You never stopped being that person. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret looked out the restaurant window. When your father left, I thought I had lost everything. Emily nodded. I know, but I was wrong. Emily smiled. Because of the warehouse? Margaret shook her head. No. What then? Margaret's eyes softened. I discovered I still have myself. Across town, Richard was reaching a very different conclusion. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation became worse, much worse. Every few days, another developer submitted an offer, and each offer was larger than the last. 8 million, 12 million, 15 million, 21 million. The numbers kept climbing. Every new offer felt like a punch to the stomach. Because every dollar represented something he believed should have been his, Vanessa became increasingly frustrated. You have to do something. Richard looked exhausted. There is nothing I can do. There has to be. There isn't. She paced the room. What about challenging ownership? My attorneys already tried. What about negotiating? Richard remained silent, because deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't interested in negotiating. He wanted control, and that control was gone. Then one morning, something happened that shocked everyone. Richard called Margaret. It was the first time he had contacted her since the divorce. Margaret stared at the phone for several seconds before answering. Hello? There was a brief pause. Then Richard spoke. His voice sounded strangely soft. Margaret. She immediately recognized what he was doing. The charm, the warmth, the friendliness, the same tactics he used whenever he wanted something. What do you want, Richard? Another pause. I was hoping we could talk. About what? You know. No, I don't. Richard forced a laugh. The warehouse. There it was, straight to the point. Margaret smiled quietly. For months, she had imagined this conversation. Now it was finally happening. You mean the warehouse that belongs to me? Richard swallowed. Yes. Margaret stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the sun shone brightly across the city. The storm that had surrounded her life for months was finally clearing. "What about it?" she asked. Richard took a deep breath. Then came the words he never thought he would say. "Maybe we should meet." Margaret looked at her reflection in the glass. The old Margaret might have agreed immediately. The old Margaret would have hoped for reconciliation. The old Margaret would have given him another chance. But that woman was gone. And Richard was about to discover just how much she had changed. Because the next move in this game would belong entirely to Margaret Collins. And for the first time in 40 years, Richard Collins would be the one waiting for her decision. Richard and Margaret met one final time at a quiet cafe overlooking the river where they had once spent their early years together. Richard arrived carrying a folder filled with proposals, calculations, and arguments. Margaret arrived carrying nothing but peace. For nearly an hour, Richard talked about partnerships, fairness, and what they had built together. He suggested sharing the profits from the warehouse. He even hinted that perhaps they had both made mistakes and should find a way to move forward as friends. When he finally finished, Margaret looked at him calmly. "Richard, when I walked out of that courthouse, you told me I had never built anything." Richard lowered his eyes. "You remember that?" "I remember every word." Silence settled between them. Then Margaret smiled not with anger, but with understanding. "The difference between us is that I helped build a life. You only learned how to build wealth." Richard had no answer. A few months later, the bidding war ended. Warehouse 17 sold for a record-breaking price, making Margaret financially secure for the rest of her life. Instead of buying luxury cars or expensive vacations, she purchased a comfortable home, established a foundation to help abandoned seniors, and funded community programs for elderly women starting over after divorce. For the first time in decades, she lived entirely on her own terms. Meanwhile, Richard's world slowly unraveled. Several risky investments failed, business pressures mounted. Vanessa, who had once celebrated his success, quietly left when the future no longer looked so certain. The mansion remained large, the bank accounts remained full. Yet Richard found himself sitting alone more often than ever before. One autumn afternoon, years later, he saw Margaret speaking at the opening of a new community center funded by her foundation. She looked confident, respected, and genuinely happy. For a moment, he remembered the woman who had stood beside him through every struggle, every setback, and every success. And for the first time, he understood the true cost of what he had lost. Margaret never sought revenge. She never tried to ruin him. She simply moved forward. And that became the greatest victory of all. Because in the end, the old warehouse was never the real treasure. The real treasure was the strength Richard never recognized, the loyalty he took for granted, and the woman he believed was worth nothing. The asset he forgot made Margaret a millionaire. But the lesson he ignored cost him something far more valuable. Sometimes the greatest mistake isn't losing a fortune. It's failing to recognize the value of the person who helped you build it.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to subscribe my channel.